is Rob Bilott. In case you don't know Rob's book, I'm going to hold it up here. I don't know if it's called Exposure, and it details his experiences and his challenges as he took on the corporate giant DuPont in a legal battle. Many of you may be aware of the fact that there is a movie called Dark Waters currently out. It's a 2019 movie starring Mark Ruffalo as Rob Bilott. What you may not know is that Rob is a wonderful Ohioan. And in fact, he went to not only Florida, but he went to The Ohio University for his law degree. And he is currently located in the Cincinnati region of Ohio. He is an attorney with the very prestigious firm of Taft, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Stettinitis and Hollister. He is one of their corporate attorneys and indeed a partner after 1998. And Rob details his experiences. He took on DuPont for polluting the waters in rural Ohio and more specifically West Virginia. So I want to take a moment and say, welcome, Rob. You might wave.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight and talk to everyone here. I think some of us may be hearing a new term being thrown around, or maybe seeing something on the news or in the newspapers, and wondering what the heck is this stuff that is called PFAS, or you may hear it referred to as forever chemicals, and be seeing stories about these chemicals turning up in drinking water. For example, outside of Dayton, Ohio, near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, there has been coverage of the chemicals being found in the water there. There's increasing news stories now about these chemicals being found outside military bases all over the country, now all over the world. And what we now know is these chemicals that we're going to talk about tonight are now being found over the entire planet. They are in the blood of virtually every human on this planet. They are in the blood of babies that are born today. They are in the blood of almost every living thing on the planet, including polar bears. They're being found in Arctic ice, in the polar ice caps. And you start to look at this and you realize we're talking about environmental contamination on a worldwide scale that's pretty unprecedented. And it's all something that happened during our lifetimes. This is not some historic issue that happened decades and decades ago that, back before anybody knew anything about the environment. I mean, this is something that occurred while all of us have been around. It's still going on. And it's happened right here in the United States. And a lot of this story played out right here in Ohio. In fact, some of the key issues and the key legal developments I'm going to talk about happened in a federal courthouse down the road in Columbus. I'd like to take some time tonight to talk about the story of how this happened. How did we get here, and how in the world does something like this really happen and continue to go on, and really nobody knows about it. And, how it went on for decades and decades, and we're only just now learning about this. And for me, it started in 1998. I had been working for the Taft law firm. I started in the Cincinnati office right after graduating from Ohio State in 1990. And actually, this week is my 30th year at that law firm. And most of what I was doing the first 8 or so years of my career was learning the very complicated world of environmental laws, all the different state and federal laws that applied to things like emitting hazardous and toxic chemicals out into the air. How do companies get permits to put stuff into the air, get permits to put stuff into rivers, get permits to dump stuff into landfills. And for those first 8 years, I was really learning about how all that entire system worked. And I thought I fairly well understood that. Here we had a system that identified all of the nasty, toxic, hazardous materials And there were rules and regulations that specified how much of those toxic, hazardous, regulated materials were allowed into our air, into our water, into landfills. And a lot of what I was doing was helping our big chemical company clients comply with those rules and regulations. Most of what I was doing was what people would call corporate defense. I was helping these companies comply, understand these rules and regulations, and learning them myself, frankly. Then I got a call one day, October of 1998, and this man on the other end of the line starts telling me all about cows that were dropping dead on his property, and I needed to help him. And I was about to hang up the phone. I mean, I thought, who is this? Why? How did he get my number? And why is he telling me about cows? And then he blurted out, "I got your name from your grandmother." And so I paused and listened a little more closely to figure out what's the connection here. And what I learned is this gentleman was raising cows on a farm outside of Parkersburg, West Virginia, down along the Ohio River, the Mid-Ohio Valley. And this was a community I knew well. My dad was in the Air Force. We had spent a lot of time outside military bases, including Wright-Patt. Went to high school up there in Fairborn. But anytime we moved around, we always came back to my mom's hometown, where she had grown up, where her grandmother had grown up. We went and spent almost every holiday, birthdays, and that was Parkersburg. So I kind of viewed it as my hometown. And what I understood was going on here is this gentleman had cows, and they were grazing on property right next to a landfill. And this landfill apparently had white foaming water coming out of a pipe. And this gentleman's animals used the creek that this pipe was discharging into for the drinking water. And this white foaming water had started coming out. And after this white foam appeared, these animals started getting tumors. They started getting blackened teeth. They were wasting away no matter how much he fed them. And the animals were dropping dead. And they were giving birth to stillborn calves or calves with deformed eyes. He couldn't, though, get anybody really to talk to him about this. Because it ended up, this particular landfill was owned by the DuPont company. And it just so happened that DuPont, which was at the time one of the world's largest chemical companies, owned a big manufacturing facility right down the road, right along the Ohio River, and employed thousands of people. They were one of the biggest employers in that town. And a lot of the folks there either worked for the company, or their family did, or they knew somebody that did. And when this farmer started saying, "Look, I got a problem with this landfill owned by DuPont," none of the lawyers really wanted to talk to him. When he called the state Environmental Protection Agency, he wasn't getting anywhere. When he called the company, he wasn't getting anywhere. He called the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, he wasn't getting any help. None of the local lawyers wanted to take this on. So one day he was talking to his neighbor across the fence. And it just so happened that neighbor was one of my grandmother's good friends that went back decades. And she had just been on the phone with my grandmother, who was bragging about her grandson, who was an environmental lawyer in Cincinnati. So certainly I could help out. So that's why he had called me. And I heard this story and I thought, at least I can do is take a look at what this man's got, what the problem is here. After all, this is what I did every day. I helped companies get permits to run landfills like this. Maybe it was something we could get to the bottom of pretty easily. After all, there should be a permit that identifies all the chemicals that are going into that landfill, giving limits, and there's probably something maybe that's being emitted too high, and we could help this gentleman out. So we invited him up to our office, and that was back in 1998. He and his wife drove up, met in our offices, and they were armed. Keep in mind, this is 1998, so this was the day of VHS tapes and televisions and VCRs. He came loaded with stacks of VHS tapes and photographs. And we started watching those. And it was pretty evident when we looked at these that there was a serious problem here. We could see white foaming water coming out of this pipe, marked EI DuPont de Nemours, which is the name of the DuPont company, outfall. And you could see these animals in a horrendous condition, foaming at the mouth, tumors, black teeth. And the farmer, whose name was Wilbur Tennant, he actually had started cutting into these animals when they died because nobody would come out to help him. The vets wouldn't come out. So he started cutting into them and, to see what was going on. And you could see deformed organs and tumors and green ooze. So it was pretty obvious there was a problem. And it looked like it was something in this white foaming water. And again, we thought, you know what? This is a family friend. This looks like a fairly simple project. We can pull those permits. We should be able to get to the bottom of what's going on here pretty quickly. After all, our firm had never represented DuPont. DuPont was never a client. But we knew these folks. They often would be at some of the same cleanup sites that we would be helping our clients with across the country. The DuPont lawyers would be there representing their clients. So I knew these guys, and I thought, these guys have a great reputation. Once they see this, I'm sure they'll want to get to the bottom of it too. So we took that case on for Mr. Tennant and his family in 1999. And I started doing what I would normally do. I went to the government agencies and got all their permits, started reviewing everything, and frankly, I couldn't find anything that would explain what we were seeing. Nothing on the list of regulated hazardous materials was jumping out at me. There's really nothing that was explaining what we were seeing, why we would have this white foam, or what was happening to the animals. And so we ended up bringing this lawsuit against DuPont after looking at all these documents and not seeing anything. And the DuPont lawyers were very cooperative with us at the beginning. Sure, we'll give you everything about what's going into that landfill, all the regulated listed chemicals, everything about what's permitted there. And then it occurred to me as I'm looking through this, I'm not seeing anything. Maybe I'm going to ask for everything that's going in that landfill and everything that's made at the plant down the river that's sending waste to this landfill. And then things changed. We started getting pushback from the company. Oh, no. No need to go beyond what's in the permit. This is wild, out of control. And we had to go to court. We got a court order. We finally forced the company to turn over these documents. And I started looking through the documents. And one day there was one that popped out that mentions that there was a lot of this particular chemical that was going to this landfill. And I looked at it, and I had never heard of this chemical. It was called PFOA. And I went to all the textbooks and all the reference books we had. I couldn't find it. I looked at all the list of hazardous regulated materials. I couldn't find any information about this. So I went even and asked some of our experts, you ever heard of this? No, So I thought it was odd that we were seeing this document referencing a lot of this stuff going into this landfill. So I started asking DuPont, hey, what's this stuff, PFOA? And then we got even more pushback and more court orders. And we finally got the company ordered to turn over all of its documents about this odd, strange chemical. And then I started pouring through those. And I don't know how many of you out there, unfortunately, I can't see a show of hands, but how many of you have seen the movie Dark Waters, or you saw the documentary The Devil We Know, and you see all of these boxes of documents, and that was fairly accurate. These are the days before things were done electronically. So you had hard copy paper coming in, lots of it. And so I spent a lot of time starting to dig through these historic records that went back to the 1940s and 50s when that plant first went into operation along the Ohio River. Saw a very disturbing story. What I saw was this stuff, PFOA, was a chemical that had been first manufactured by the 3M company right after World War II. Completely man-made chemical, never existed on the planet prior to some research done, frankly, in connection with the Manhattan Project and all during the World War II. This man-made chemical was apparently really useful in the manufacturing process because it had this unusual chemical bond of carbons attached to fluorine, which I was not a chemistry major. That's why I went to law school, to avoid chemistry. But what I soon learned was this particular chemical structure made it incredibly hard to break it apart. And so this chemical was really useful in manufacturing because it didn't fall apart in the manufacturing process. Well, DuPont had started purchasing this stuff from 3M as early as 1951. And they were using it to manufacture Teflon. The big manufacturing plant down the road happened to be the world's largest Teflon manufacturing facility. And so this chemical, PFOA, they were using as a processing aid, something to help them make Teflon. But keep in mind the timing here. This is 1951. They start taking tons of this material in. US EPA and environmental regulations as we know it in this country, the US EPA didn't even come into existence until 1970. The first regulations governing new chemicals coming out on the market and what kind of safety tests need to be done didn't come out until 1976, 1978. So we're talking decades before that happened. These chemicals start going down to this plant along the Ohio River. They're used in the Teflon manufacturing plant. And because they're not regulated, there were no regulations in all of that time, they're emitted up into the air through the smokestacks. They're being discharged directly into the Ohio River. And liquid sludges from the manufacturing plant are being dumped into pits, unlined pits all around that plant property where they then seep into the groundwater. And there are public drinking water wells right next to this plant. So I'm looking at all of this, and then I see that even though it's not regulated, this is before a lot of these regulations come into effect, this is the DuPont company, which not only is one of the world's largest chemical manufacturers, they also at the time had some of the top scientists in the world. They had thousands of scientists at their own internal labs who started looking at this unique chemical structure and being concerned about it, that its inability to break down, what did that mean when it got out into the environment? And, because once it got into the environment, it would essentially never be broken apart. It would stay out there for millions of years. And we actually got testimony in later years from some of the folks at the company that it essentially never broke down. It would be here after humans were off the planet. So DuPont, realizing this stuff was being emitted into the air, emitted into the Ohio River, there was potential exposure. How toxic is this stuff if it doesn't break down? They started doing animal studies, rats, monkeys, beagles, rabbits back in the early 1960s. And those studies were coming back showing the stuff was toxic to multiple different animal species throughout different organ systems. And then they got even more disturbing data, which is not only is it toxic to animals, but that humans exposed to this stuff would get it into their blood. We are exposed to a lot of chemicals every day. Most of them our body can flush out, and we excrete them pretty quickly. This stuff had the ability to get into people when they're exposed to it and bind to the blood, where it then circulates and recirculates over and over, and it stays in the body and in the blood. It persists there for long, long periods of time because our body doesn't know how to break down this weird man-made chemical chain. So 3M, the manufacturer, and DuPont realized this by 1976, that this stuff was getting into the workers and getting into their blood. Not only that, it was staying there, and every exposure was building up over time. So they knew it was toxic. They were now learning it was persistent, getting into people. And then they started saying, okay, well, gee, is it getting out into the community? Because we know we've been putting it out into the Ohio River. We know it's going out of our air stacks. It's leaking into the groundwater under our plant. So by the 1980s, they started testing around this plant in West Virginia. And I'm reading all of this in these historic documents. By the 1981, they realized the stuff was getting into the air and going across into Ohio, where it would fall on the soils right where there was a public water supply in Little Hocking, Ohio. And then they looked at where it was going into the groundwater. And they realized they had public water supplies wells, not only across the river in Ohio, but right next to the plant in West Virginia. So as early as 1984, they went out and started collecting public drinking water samples. And what did they find? It was in the public water. And they knew that by 1984, but it was unregulated. Well, then something even more concerning happened. The first cancer study comes back by 1987. And again, it's not regulated. The regulators don't even know this chemical's out there. Public doesn't know anything about it. The DuPont scientists, though, looking at the toxicity, the persistence. Well, they now see that they've got this cancer study that comes back, and it says this stuff causes testicular tumors in the rats. Not just might be related, it is causing testicular tumors. So the DuPont scientists actually look at that data and internally classify the chemical as a confirmed animal carcinogen, possible human carcinogen, as early as 1988. And even though there's no state or federal regs, because the regulators don't know about this stuff, the DuPont scientists, knowing that it's going out into the drinking water, they actually set an internal guideline, no more than 0.6 parts per billion. And you may be saying, well, what does that matter? I don't even understand what that, because that was basically the lowest level you could detect it in water back then, was about 0.6 parts per billion. They rounded it up to 1 part per billion. They went back out and tested the water. What did they find? 3 to 5 parts per billion in the public water. But didn't say anything. And I'm actually reading draft press releases to the public in case somebody finds out. What do we say? How do we explain this? So I'm looking at all this data. And then I see what happened is once they found it was getting into the public water and it was at these really elevated levels, they thought it was coming from these pits that had been dug around the property and all the sludge had been dumped. And if they just get rid of that sludge, maybe they can make this drinking water problem go away. So they went and dug up 7,000 tons of sludge soaked with this chemical. And where did they take it? The landfill right next to Mr. Tennant's property. Unlined, non-hazardous landfill, because after all, this was an unregulated chemical. It was non-hazardous. So they took 7,000 tons of this stuff, dumped it into this landfill, and actually went out and started sampling the levels of the stuff in the creek that the cows were drinking from as early as 1990. They dumped it there in 1988. And by 1990, remember their drinking water guideline was 1 part per billion. They found 1,000 parts per billion in the creek that the cows were drinking from. So as I'm reading all of this and realizing they had all this information, they never told our client, they were looking at what does this do to cows that drink it, all right? I made a phone call and we settled the case for Mr. Tennant at that point. But at that point, we also now realized this went far beyond Mr. Tennant and his family. This now involved the entire community. We were realizing we had information suggesting the entire surrounding community that had this in their public drinking water had it at levels above what the company themselves was saying was safe. Nobody knew. And we may be the only ones who have seen these documents. So we struggled with what do we do with this information? I mean, this was a public health threat. So I put together a letter in March of 2001 and sent it to the US EPA, the Department of Justice, every agency I could think of, giving them these internal documents and saying, I think there's a public health threat here. You really ought to look into this chemical and do something about this stuff in the water. Now, at that point, the community finally found out about it. And we had members of the community, including Joe Kiger. Again, those of you who have seen the movie, and I talk about this in a lot more detail in the book, came to us and said, hey, now that we know this is in our water and what it could do to these animals and what we're seeing it's doing to the workers, there were worker studies showing increased cancer rates. We want this out of our water now, and we want to know what's it going to do to us in the long term. Now, remember, this is something, and I try to, and I know we don't have that much time, but again, in the book, I try to explain the legal problem that this created. I mean, because keep in mind, in 2001, when we're dealing with this, it's not regulated. There are no state or federal laws that we can cite to that they're exceeding. Really, what we see here is their own internal standard is being violated. Their own scientists are saying, you know, this could be a risk to humans that are drinking this. So we ended up kind of fashioning and taking kind of a unique approach where we ended up bringing a class action on behalf of that entire community, where we were seeking to get the water cleaned up and medical testing through something called medical monitoring, which I won't bore you with all the legal details of that, but it was a kind of unique way to bring a claim like this when there was not a regulated standard for it. And as soon as we brought that case, this was August of 2001, the company realizing gee, this stuff, we've got a problem because the only standard that exists is our own standard, and we're exceeding it. They went to the state of West Virginia to try to come up with a government standard. And unfortunately, it was the DuPont folks that were on the committee that helped set this. And there you'll see a scene like what kind of dramatized of how that happened in the movie. I go into detail about what was really going on here. There was a lot of the games start, because the company then tried to get a higher safety level. And the state came out after the DuPont folks got together and they said, oh, no, 1 part per billion is irrelevant. We now say up to 150 parts per billion is perfectly fine. And luckily that didn't affect our case. Our case went forward. But at that point, the US EPA starts digging into these documents that I sent them. And by the fall of 2002, they announced this stuff looks pretty bad. And we are going to initiate a priority review. We may actually take action to ban this chemical under this federal law called the Toxic Substances and Control Act. And remember how I said, these laws came out like in 1976 that first started regulating chemicals coming onto the market. Well, when that law came out, it really focused on new chemicals made after that date. But for existing chemicals, the way that worked, and I'm oversimplifying, but the way that worked is it was up to the companies that were making and using those existing chemicals to alert the EPA if there was anything suggesting a threat or a substantial risk to human health or the environment, because after all, those were already out there. And so what I was seeing in these documents over and over was the company, despite all these studies and all this information that was coming out, kept repeatedly making the decision not to tell the EPA. So once I told the EPA in my letter, they started digging into it, and they actually announced that they would do this priority review. And in fact, by June of 2004, the US EPA sued DuPont, saying they had withheld information about the toxicity of this chemical. And if we had been given this information, we might have been able to begin regulating this stuff decades ago. But now we're having to play catch up. So when EPA sued them, and also it was about this point in time, this story finally started getting reported in some of the media. And I talk about this a lot more in the book about how important it was for this story to actually start getting reported in the media and for people to understand it wasn't just a problem here in West Virginia. This was something that could have bigger implications. In the film, in the documentary, and in Dark Waters, you see the story that's broadcast on ABC's 2020 in 2003. It was kind of one of the first shows that was really starting to talk about the potential implications here. Shortly after that, and after the EPA brought their lawsuit, DuPont settles our case. And this is in 2004. And what they agree to do is immediately put in water filtration systems to stop the ongoing exposures. But most importantly, we agree we want to know through independent scientists, what's this stuff actually going to do to people over time? And again, I talk about this a lot more in the book, but what we learned through this process was the way in which the science had been generated and controlled up through this point. A lot of us think, hey, it's in the scientific literature, or it's published and peer-reviewed, and if it's not, then maybe it's junk science. But what we were seeing was all of the data that existed, the company was choosing what got published and peer-reviewed. And since they had been really the only ones ever publishing anything about the chemical, when it came time for others to ever publish anything that was maybe suggesting something different, like maybe it does present a harm, that the people that were peer reviewing were the company scientists. So we knew that the system for the way the science was getting out was really had some problems. So we wanted to set up this completely independent way that we would be able to confirm what we had been seeing in the internal documents, which is whether or not that chemical did in fact present harm to the people that were drinking it at the levels they were drinking it. So we did something really unique. We set up this thing called the science panel. Both sides could pick these completely independent scientists who'd never worked for either side, and they were given a unique task. Look at all of the data, not just what's published and peer reviewed, which is really what the companies have been choosing to publish and peer review, but all of it, including the internal studies. And most importantly, we want you to do new studies of this community and actually look at all of the data and tell us whether or not drinking this is linked with disease or not. And we took $70 million that the company gave as a settlement, and we did something even more unique. Rather than cut checks to everybody and walk away and just hope things worked out, we realized what really was missing here was the raw data. Every time we saw cancer studies or worker studies that suggested a higher cancer rate, what we'd hear back from the company was, well, that's not a big enough study. You don't have enough evidence that actually is linked with disease. And there's only a couple cases. There's not enough evidence, not enough evidence, not enough evidence. And so we realized we needed a bigger study, one that had enough people to actually confirm what we had been seeing. And we had no idea whether this would work or not, but we took that 70 million and we offered everyone in this community, 70,000 people, that we would pay them if they came in and provided a blood sample to tell us how much of the chemical was in their blood, give us access to the medical records, keep all that confidential, of course, but turn it over to these independent scientists. And much to our surprise, we had 69,000 people come forward and participate in that community. Ended up being one of the biggest human health studies ever done anywhere on any chemical. So these scientists then had all of this data. They designed some of the biggest, most impressive human health studies ever done, 12 different massive studies looking at all kinds of different disease endpoints, creating all kinds of models to figure out exactly how much everybody was exposed to at their house over the past 50 years. You know, just amazing work. It took them, though, 7 years to do this because we had no idea how long this would take. This process started up in 2005, 2006, didn't finish until 2012. So what was going on in the meantime? Well, after we set up this settlement, the US EPA, who had just sued DuPont, they settled with DuPont. DuPont announced that they would pay a $16 million fine, which was supposed to be the largest administrative penalty in the history of the EPA. But again, 16 million. This is a company that was making billions a year off this chemical. And then the company announced it would stop manufacturing PFOA in the United States, stop using it over the next 10 years. There would be a 10-year phase out. So that was announced as a great thing that, you know, there would be no more made. Problem was it wasn't addressing what about the stuff that's already out there and that is likely to stay there forever unless we do something to remove it. But unfortunately, the EPA at that point kind of backed off and it went away. And what we realized was this chemical wasn't just used in making Teflon. The chemical had been used in making a variety of products, things like stain-resistant, waterproof clothing, carpeting, fast food wrappers and packaging, microwave popcorn bag liners, firefighting foams, you name it. So the potential that this chemical was not just in the water in West Virginia, but was likely in water all over the United States was out there. Yet what we heard from the EPA and others was, well, your science panel is now working on whether there are really health threats from this. And until they're done, we're going to wait and see what happens. Well, 7 years go by at this point, 2006 to 2012. And what's going on in the meantime, too? The economy's collapsing. You know, we have the massive economic meltdown of 2008 to 2010, and I talk about that in the book, you know, about the effect something like that has. You know, we had no idea where this case was going to end up, whether the science panel would prove these things that we were seeing. We were spending a ton of money, not only with experts, but monitoring what was going on in the science, and the economy is collapsing around us. And it was pretty stressful. And, you know, I talk about that in the book. You see some of that depicted in the film as well. But at the end of the day, in 2012, that science panel came back and confirmed that drinking it was linked with 6 different diseases, including testicular cancer, the same cancer we had seen in the rat study decades earlier. It was confirmed that was happening in the community. Kidney cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, and high cholesterol. And so when those findings were finalized, it had a series of consequences. First, everybody in that community was then entitled to medical monitoring to see whether they were getting that disease going forward. And DuPont had to pay that, up to $235 million in testing. That started, and thousands of people enrolled in that program. But everybody who actually had one of those diseases was then allowed to move forward with individual cases against DuPont for damages. We had 3,500 people in that community of about 70,000 who decided to come forward and bring those claims. Those cases started getting filed, and they were all then pulled together in one federal court proceeding down in Columbus, Ohio, in federal court. And we started finally moving those cases to trial. The first case went to trial in 2015. And I talk about that again, a little more detail in the book, about that story of that particular individual. And week-long trial, weeks, I should say, 6 weeks, going through all of this evidence, all of this data, where all of this information that had been frankly hidden for decades was finally coming out to the public. The jury was looking at all of this, looking at these arguments that, well, the evidence just isn't there, and there's, this is not proven. That jury came back and said that DuPont is responsible for having caused that woman's kidney cancer. Then we had 3 more trials, and all of them were verdicts against DuPont, including punitive damages, juries finding that the company had acted with conscious disregard of the risks after they looked at all of this data. And while this is going on, a pretty significant event happened. In 2016, these trials started in 2015, but in January of 2016, I'll back up 1 second here. As these trials are going on, I had sent this science panel data to the US EPA. And at that point said, okay, what more could we possibly need to move forward and set drinking water standards now for this stuff in water? And it was at that point where the EPA finally, for the first time, started requiring public water supplies all across the country to start testing not only for PFOA, but a closely related chemical that also had 8 carbons, a C8, an 8 carbon, called PFOS, and also made by 3M. But this was the stuff used in Scotchgard and a lot of firefighting foams. So the agency started requiring the public water supplies to start sampling for that, but it was still not regulated. So that data is being collected, it's going into EPA, and I'm looking at it on the EPA's website, but the public isn't being told that this stuff's being found in the water because it's not regulated, it's not required to be told. So, but then that changed in 2016. The New York Times Magazine ran a story that summarized this whole history, and for the first time, made the point that this wasn't just happening in West Virginia. This wasn't just along the Ohio River. This stuff was now being found in drinking water across the country. So even though it had been 15 years since I had first asked EPA to come up with a drinking water guideline of this, 4 months later, after that story came out, EPA came out with their first guideline for this stuff in drinking water. And that then prompted states all across the country to begin testing. The U.S. Department of Defense, which had heavily used firefighting foams at military bases and fire training facilities all across the country, started systematically sampling sites all across the United States and across the world. So by late 2016 and early 2017, almost every day, a new community somewhere in the United States or across the world was learning these chemicals were in their water. They start demanding that the EPA do something about it, take action. And as that finally started coming out, what we saw happen was they started realizing it wasn't just these 2 chemicals that were being found in the water and that were now being found in everyone's blood across the world. After the companies had announced they were going to phase those out, they were going to phase out those chemicals, they had started bringing new replacement chemicals onto the market. What they had done is they had taken these C8s and knocked a couple of carbons off, called them C6s or C4s. And suddenly these were new chemicals that all of these studies we had finally done, it took us 20 years to get all of that science out and finally get to the point where we can push the regulators to start setting standards and phasing these chemicals out. Well, they tweak the chemical by a couple molecules, call it new, and then say none of those studies applied because this was now a different new chemical. So what the scientists and the regulators started seeing was there were hundreds, if not thousands, of chemicals in the same family of completely man-made synthetic carbon fluorine chemicals that we now call PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkylated substances. And that they're all over the place. They're in water, they're in air. So now we see movements across the world that try to address these chemicals in a much more comprehensive way. Because what we see and what this story showed was how almost impossible it is to get chemicals regulated, despite how much information you have, how difficult it is for the people who are exposed to actually get relief because of the way our legal system is set up. And again, something I talk about extensively in the book is just the way our system, our legal system works as far as who has the burden of proof, who has to prove these things, how science is handled in the courtroom. Cases like this, where a community is exposed to a chemical that's not regulated like this, the community is told it's their burden to prove that the chemical's causing harm. And this case was one of the few times in history where the community was actually able to get that evidence through those massive studies and actually prove that. Yet we're still having difficulty getting it regulated, getting this through the system. So, when this story came out, and particularly when the New York Times Magazine story came out, I got a call one day from Mark Ruffalo, who was very active in the water and environmental area, saying, I just read about this, and this is something that's occurring all over the country, all over the planet. How is it I never heard of this? And how do we get this story out to a bigger population? And so he teamed up with the folks at Participant Media and did the film Dark Waters. And that was actually, they came to our offices in Cincinnati and did most of the filming there in Cincinnati, a lot of it in our offices. In fact, you'll see a lot of the folks from Taft as extras in the background. Some of the scenes were filmed at the firm and in places we used as well. And that film was done in pretty record time. The filming started in January of 2019, ended a couple months later, and it was in theaters by November, right about the time for the pandemic to hit. And a documentary was done as well called The Devil We Know, which is now out on Netflix, which focuses on a lot of the real folks. But as this story was coming out, and as we started to learn that this was a bigger problem, this is affecting everybody across the planet. And I was hearing these arguments I had heard 20 years ago, particularly as we started seeing these new replacement chemicals. For example, the C6 I mentioned, when DuPont phased out PFOA, the C8, they switched to this C6, which they called Gen X. And sure enough, within a matter of years, it was being found in the drinking water right down from its plant in North Carolina. Hundreds of thousands of people were drinking it. And it was almost as if we were going back in time to 1998, because when it was discovered in the Wilmington, North Carolina drinking water, we heard it's unregulated. There's no science showing that it's causing harm. And all that stuff about PFOA, that's a different chemical. So, as I hear this argument and I saw that this is what we're going to keep coming up with, we're going to have the same repeating problem over and over again. I wanted to find a way to get this story out to folks so that they could see how this happened, why it still keeps happening, how it's not just a legal issue, it's also an issue that involves the way our science is generated, how things are published, how science is generated, how our regulatory system works, how our political system works, all of these different things combining together to create this perfect storm that's really illustrated by the story of PFOA. And hopefully, if we could put that all together in a way that people would see how this happened, how it affects real people, and what could be done, to try to fix it, that people would at least maybe start to understand what we might need to do to fix it so it never happens again. and so that we can find innovative ways to maybe fix some of these systemic problems. You know, if you think about it, this has been going on with this one chemical for 22 years now. It took that long to get this story out to the public. And yet now we're shifting to these related chemicals and being told we need to do this all over again. And, you know, we've got to find a way to do things in a different way. And hopefully the book helps explain how that happened, what led to this happening, how these intersections of law, regulatory world, scientific world, political world, how all of that yielded these results, and hopefully give people inspiration to know, hey, here's a new way, maybe we can fix this. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions. Sorry, I spoke maybe a little too long, but I'm happy to take any questions about it. And again, thank you all. And I'm really delighted to be able to be here tonight with you.
Rob, we're full of questions.
Ah, okay.
I've noticed that the states are beginning the regulation of PFAs and PFOSs, and California specifically has Senator Ben Allen, who wants to regulate fire departments and airports with the foam, stop using the firefighting foam, and more importantly, he was very interested in the disposal of PFAS. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Similarly, North Carolina put up a subsurface water barrier, as is my understanding, and installed a groundwater extraction system for these PFASs. Do you think that the state's attorney generals are speaking about this? Is there a way that we can bring this to their attention so that is this really a state regulated issue or a federal regulated issue?
Lots of good questions. And, you know, as a lawyer, I hate to do my little legal disclaimer, but, you know, everything I'm talking about tonight obviously is my personal experience, my personal views. I have a lot of clients. I'm not here speaking on behalf of any of them. For example, we are working with state attorney generals. We are working with water providers. We are working with communities. We are, you know, as this issue finally has kind of hit the public awareness, people are realizing the scope and severity of the mess we now have to deal with. You know, you've got contaminated drinking water supplies. You have small municipalities and large municipalities that are struggling with realizing they have to spend millions and millions of dollars for filtration systems, not only to put those systems in, but then the cost to maintain them, and possibly then deal with the waste that's generated from those. And it's unclear how that will be handled, whether it'll be ever designated hazardous or not. There's debate right now going on at the state level, at the federal level, as to how should we regulate these chemicals. Should they be regulated as hazardous? Should they be listed? There's debate. You know, we're seeing that actually get discussed for the first time in all of these years. It's only happened, frankly, in the last 18 to 24 months that those discussions have even started to happen. And unfortunately, we haven't seen much activity happen at the federal level yet, either from legislation or as regulations. So as one of the listeners here has mentioned, what we see happen in states have started moving forward on their own to protect their citizens by setting their own drinking water standards and guidelines. And what we've seen is, since that EPA guideline came out in 2016, the states that have looked at it, the safety level is dropping lower and lower and lower. And we're getting almost to the point, you know, somebody mentioned California, where these levels are almost down to the point now of, again, if you can detect it, they're concerned about it. So we're seeing incredible levels of activity among water providers, states that are dealing now with massive contamination of their natural resources, the soil, the air, the water, the plants, the fish in their states, and, you know, communities that are left struggling with this. So, you know, I think you're going to see an increasing level of activity here because these are incredibly expensive issues. This stuff is out there. Everything that's been emitted over the last 70 years is still out there in our soil, in our water, in us, in our blood. And, unless it's removed, it's going to remain there. So who pays for that? That's something that's being debated right now. These are not naturally occurring chemicals. It's not like lead, or arsenic, where you might have a natural source. If you're finding this stuff in the water, in the soil, in your blood, we have a pretty good idea of where it came from, because there's only a couple of companies that made this stuff, and it's a fingerprint back to them. And so as you can imagine, there's been an explosion of litigation just in the last year since all of this data started coming out, and all of the information about all of these new water supplies that are contaminated, all of these new communities that are learning about it. And we're trying to help in that regard as well. And with firefighters, you mentioned the firefighting foam. And I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but with the firefighting foam, you've got firefighters that had no idea they were being exposed to this stuff in the firefighting foam they were using, or possibly in the gear that they're wearing that may have historically been treated with stain or water-resistant coatings that contain these chemicals that may be breaking down over time. So, all of that is just now starting to really kind of hit, and people are becoming aware of that exposure. And what are we doing, as I mentioned before? Well, you don't have enough evidence to show it's causing any harm. You shouldn't be able to get compensated or reimbursed for your cleanup costs. So I have filed a new case, and I mentioned this at the end of the book, in Columbus, Ohio, where we're seeking now to bring a class action on behalf of everyone in the country who has these chemicals in their blood. And the goal is not to get money. The goal is to have the science finished and done that will confirm for us exactly what is this big group of chemicals that we now know we're being exposed to, this entire class. What are they doing to us? Have independent scientists confirm that. And most importantly, that have it done in a way that we, the taxpayers, the people who are exposed without our knowledge and against our will, we're not footing the bill. Have the companies who did this, knowing it would get out and knowing it would get into our blood, they should pay for that study. So sorry for that long answer.
One individual asks what they can do as a lone taxpayer. What would you recommend?
Speak out. Stand up, speak out. I'm hoping, if anything, when you read the story of Mr. Tennant or Joe Kiger or Ken Walmsley, one of the employees at the plant, or the Sue Bailey and the folks that work there at the plant, or you see the movie or any of these films, that you're inspired to know one person standing up and speaking out can make a huge difference. And don't assume that somebody else is going to be doing this for you, that there are others out there taking care of this. I think a lot of us, particularly here in the United States, just assume, well, of course, somebody is handling all of this, and all of these, if it's bad, somebody would have told us or would have regulated it. And I think this story, unfortunately, really makes vividly clear how little information we know about what we're really being exposed to, how many other chemicals are out there like this that we just don't have, we aren't being told what the health risks are. So again, stand up, speak out, demand information about this. There are organizations out there right now, the Environmental Working Group, Center for Environmental Health, Green Science Policy Institute. There were coalitions announced with the launch of the movie called FightForeverChemicals.com. Their goal is making information available to people to know where were these chemicals used, what products used them in the past, and which companies are moving away from them, so that you can at least start to make a choice. We didn't have a choice up to now to be exposed because we didn't even know where these chemicals were used or what products they were used in. But hopefully making information available to people, spread awareness, talk about it, have discussions like this, and talk to your neighbors, talk to your legislators, whoever you have access to, because having the information is the key.
Related to all of this is, DuPont may have tremendous pockets, but can they possibly pay for all of the cost that this is going to cause? And is it solely DuPont? Aren't there 6 very large chemical companies, and do they each bear responsibility? Do they all manufacture some of these components?
Yeah, when we talk about the broad class of PFAS chemicals, you're talking about a fairly small group, a handful of companies. It's not just DuPont, but 3M and others that have made these raw chemicals over time. And what we saw, an interesting thing happen as these cases were finally getting to trial, and DuPont was finally being held liable, and the public was learning, about what was going on. We saw DuPont basically try to jettison away this entire business. They spun off the entire Teflon business into a completely new company called Chemours. And then there were concerns about whether that company would have the assets, to pay for all of this. And in fact, Chemours and DuPont, got into a lawsuit with each other over who should pay for this. Because as you can imagine, these costs are potentially very, very large. And there is a small group, of companies that could be responsible here, but they should have more than enough assets to handle this. And again, they've got the assets to handle it. They made billions upon billions for many, many years, selling these, producing them, releasing them, knowing, that these consequences would happen.
What about regulation? Do you think that this should be a federally regulated or a locally regulated investigation into PFASs?
Well, I'm hoping that, what we see happening right now is investigations at the federal, state, international, and local level. It took a long time to get there. It took a long time for these agencies to even know these chemicals existed, let alone there's a problem here that we really need to look into. But right now, we do have investigations going on at the US EPA. We have investigations going on almost in every state across the country, with scientists working almost night and day on this class of chemicals. We have discussions occurring internationally. I was at the European Union, just several months ago talking about this, and in the UK, before the UN, where they're trying to find a comprehensive way to deal with this, because it's not a local problem. It's not just in one state. It's not even just in one country. This stuff has the ability, once it gets out into the air, for example, PFOA, it can bind to the water droplets in the clouds and then move across the planet. So it's great that we may say you can't make any more of it in the United States, but as long as it's still being made in China or somewhere else, it has the potential to be contaminating the rest of the planet. So there's a lot of movement right now to try to find a way to deal with this in a comprehensive, international, global manner. And as you can imagine, that's not easy. And it's not necessarily easy to get these countries to agree on how to do it.
What about the young bride that gets a Teflon frying pan as a wedding gift? Should she use it? Should she not use it?
It probably depends on when it was made. But, keep in mind, the biggest concern here is with having this stuff in your drinking water. Getting these chemicals from the manufacturing processes released out into the air, into the drinking water, into your blood. Releases off a pan hopefully shouldn't be as large. And frankly, what we've seen happen over the last 10 years, remember how PFOA was being phased out and the companies have switched over to different materials. They still may be making a lot of these same nonstick coatings, but it might have one of these new PFAS chemicals in them. I'm sure folks have noticed these late night television commercials, for example, advertising nonstick cookware, and you may see them say PFOA free. That's one. That's the one we've been talking about and had all the studies on. It doesn't necessarily mean it's PFAS free. It could have some of the newer chemicals in them that may have just as much of a concern about them. So I think what we've seen a lot of folks recommend and suggest is, to move toward things like stainless steel or cast iron, the good old stuff that doesn't have the nonstick coatings. But there are a lot of people that are trying to innovate and find ways to make those coatings without these same chemicals without these risks. And again, to encourage the folks to hopefully to try to do that and move away from these chemistries.
You've spent at least 20 years of your life on this issue. We have to say thank you first and foremost, and acknowledge that you are a true health hero to the United States and to the world. I want to make sure that people are aware that you've received numerous awards for being Lawyer of the Year in terms of environmental litigation, as well as many others. So I want to say thank you in that regard. But what would you say to your grandkids and to your kids about all of this? We want to leave the world a better place, and this is a pretty big mess we've given them.
Yeah, it is, but I think it's one that hopefully now that we know about it and we're finally talking about it and we're looking at it, investigating, we've got some of the best minds in the world now finally focused on this. I'm confident we'll find solutions, and we'll find ways to make sure things like this don't happen again. I think it's incredibly encouraging, and hopefully people, when they see these stories and they look at what happened here, and see, that it just took one person like Mr. Tennant, saying, I'm not going to take this answer that I shouldn't be looking into this, or, it's not regulated, so it must be safe. To question that and to say, no, we need to find out what's going on here. And hopefully people are inspired by the story to know every one of us can do that. And, you never know where things will lead you. I certainly didn't know that I'd be going down this path when I picked up that phone in 1998. But, when you see something and something comes up like this, hopefully people are encouraged and inspired to know, go with it and do what you can to help fix the problem.
On that note, I'm going to say thank you. We truly appreciate your time because it's certainly exceptionally valuable. You could be hopefully solving more of this problem for us if you weren't doing this kind of thing. We'd love to say thank you, and hopefully the next time you're in Northern Ohio and there's not a virus, we'll welcome you to our community. But
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
We look forward to it. And thank you all. It was great talking with you this evening, and thanks so much for having me.
And we wish you a good evening. Good night.